The Federal Reserve just made a huge mistake that could have dire consequences for the United States economy.
This is the fourth straight meeting the Fed has left interest rates unchanged.
I'm going to tell you why I think not cutting interest rates is a terrible move and how it could impact not only the United States economy, but potentially you and your job. I'm going to do this in 3 simple, fast steps. Step number 1, let's go over how the economy right now, if you look at the data, objectively, it's extremely weak. Now, we might not be in a quote-unquote recession as defined by the NBER, but that doesn't mean the economy is healthy. Let me show you what I'm referring to. Look at a chart going all the way back to July 2024 to today's date. On the left, we go from -1% up to a +1%. Retail sales. You can see they're bouncing around here like they typically do, but the trend is down, and we've had several months where retail sales has been actually negative. Now let's zoom in on 2025. We had this big spike up, but that was just front-running tariffs. So if you eliminate this 1 month, pretty much every single month we've had is a negative number. And the retail sales just came out for the month of May, and we saw that the expectation was for a negative 0.3%. We had a negative 0.9, almost a negative 1% in retail sales month over month, for heaven's sakes. And I'd like to point out that this number is nominal. It's not even adjusted for inflation. In fact, if you go back a year, retail sales in nominal terms has only increased 0.75%. So if you do adjust for inflation, obviously this is going to be a negative number. So in an economy that's 70% consumption, if retail sales are actually negative, this is a huge red flag, but it doesn't stop there. Let's look at the ISM services data. We see that this has just dipped below 50, and usually when it does this, editor, go ahead and throw up a chart, we can see the economy is either in recession or at the very least, it's not doing well. More specifically, we have restaurant data has been plummeting as far as how much Americans are eating out. And out of all of these indicators, I think this is probably the most powerful, because I know just in my life or the experience of my friends and family members growing up, if the budget was tight, the very first thing that we cut out is restaurants. But it's not just the restaurants. We see the airlines coming out and saying that they're actually in a recession. And we see that domestic flights are down, demand is down. The only reason that they're able to maintain their profits to the degree to which they can is because fuel costs for them have decreased quite substantially. But now your friend and family member Fred, the guy that always tells you you're wrong and you shouldn't watch those George Gammon videos, the guy that believes the government is your friend and is always going to bail you out, your friend and family member Fred is watching this video and saying, oh, this George Gammon, he's crazy. The labor market is fantastic. The unemployment rate is 4.2%. And your friend and family member Fred would be correct. But as usual, he's not getting into the nuance enough. The devil is in the details. So it is true that non-farm payroll is still positive, but the expectations are terrible. So if you exceed expectations by a few thousand, but expectations are incredibly low, does that mean the economy's booming? No, that still means the economy is incredibly weak. But it's not just the non-farm payrolls that are disappointing. It's the ADP numbers. They plummeted the last print. And then if you look at the household survey instead of the establishment survey, it shows that the last data we had, the jobs in the United States contracted by almost 700,000. So you tell me how the economy can be strong or resilient, if you will, while we're losing, according to the household survey, 700,000 jobs just last month. So I know a lot of you right about now are saying to yourself, okay, George, well, how on earth is the unemployment rate only 4.2%? Because the labor force participation has declined so much because the economy is so weak and other factors such as demographics and whatnot. But the bottom line is the labor force participation goes down. So if you adjust or normalize labor force participation with the amount of job losses we've seen in the household survey, the unemployment rate would be right around 5% and heading higher as opposed to 4.2. Oh, but wait, there is more. We've got a bonus reason for you why the Fed not dropping rates is completely insane and a big mistake that can have severe negative consequences on the economy and unfortunately on your standard of living, the standard of living of the average Joe and Jane. But let's zoom out for a moment and remember why the Fed would want to pause rates. It's because they're scared of inflation. Those are the two mandates according to them. It's this unemployment and of course inflation. But if we look at all the inflation data coming out recently, it's all been under expectations. So we look at the CPI, we look at the core CPI, we look at the PPI, and what you're seeing is we didn't have this tidal wave of inflation due to the tariffs, and we still have this trend of disinflation. And let's remember, the Fed's target is 2% inflation. And it's not like we're miles away from that. Right now, we're at 2.3 or 2.4%, and again, the trend is down. So when you combine the fact that most of the data points to the United States economy being very weak and unfortunately getting weaker, with the fact that we have the CPI data saying that there's really no reason to assume that we're going to have a re-acceleration of consumer price inflation, you have to scratch your head, I'll do it, and ask yourself, why on earth wouldn't the Fed drop rates? Let's remember that the ECB right now is at 2%. And usually the Fed and the ECB kind of work in lockstep. The Bank of Canada has dropped rates all the way down to 2.75% because their unemployment rate is up at 7%. So you have all these developed economies that are dropping rates very, very quickly, while the Fed is this outlier for whatever reason, keeping rates at 4.3% in an economy that needs the Fed to be a lot lower. Step number 2. Now let's go ahead and give the Fed the benefit of the doubt for a moment and try to look at the world through their lens and the framework they're using to try to determine why on earth they're not cutting rates. So the argument is going to be, well, with the uncertainty of tariffs, or more recently, with a spike in oil prices, that could filter through the economy, increase prices, and therefore we're not going to drop rates because then that would exacerbate the inflation. The inflation would be higher than it otherwise would be. But let's put that to the test. We can go back and look at other times in U.S. history where the economy's been weak and oil prices, as an example, have spiked, and we can see what the outcome was. So I want to start by looking at a chart of oil prices going back to 2007. So 2007, 2008. And this is very important because it not only is a time when oil prices were going up, but it's also a time where you would definitely be able to say the economy was weak and getting a heck of a lot weaker. And it also coincided with a Fed rate cutting cycle that started in September of 2007. So the Fed starts dropping in September of 2007, just like they started dropping in September of 2024. And going back to the pre-GFC and during the GFC, the price of oil starts right around $72 a barrel. But it goes straight up to a point where in the middle of the summer, 2008, it's at $133 a barrel. So you would assume that this would increase prices dramatically, and you would be right. But does this mean that the Fed should have raised rates or paused during this time? Let me show you what I'm referring to. If we go to a chart of the CPI, and this is from June 07 to, call it December of 08, the CPI is represented by this red line. When they started cutting right here in September, the CPI immediately starts going up from a point right around 3.5 till we get to the middle of the summer of 2008, and it's at 5.6. Now, obviously, a lot of this would have been attributed to the price of oil going up, But again, does that mean that the Fed should have paused during this time or kept rates the same? Obviously not, because the economy was so weak that those higher oil prices would lead to disinflation, which is exactly what we saw. The CPI peaks out at 5.6, call it in June of 08, and then 6 months later, it's at 0. Why? Because we had the GFC. In other words, because the economy was extremely weak and those high oil prices were likely the catalyst that just tipped it over the edge. So why is that? It seems very counterintuitive, because if the price of oil is going up, this is an input for every single thing that we buy. So how can overall prices not go up at the same rate? Well, it goes back to the money supply. If you don't have the money supply increasing at the same rate, nominal wages likely aren't going to go up at the same rate as those oil prices. So you get into this position where society at large, the American economy, is having to rob Peter to pay Paul. So they have to put gas in their car to get to work. So that takes a larger percentage of their paycheck. Therefore, they don't have as much purchasing power to allocate to things like going out to restaurants or taking a trip and buying an airline ticket. So you see those prices go down, while this other stuff that people have to have, those prices go up. But sooner or later, the prices going up of the stuff that people have to have impacts them to such a degree that they can't spend money on anything else. And then those employers, those businesses have to fire workers. This increases the unemployment rate. Aggregate demand on net goes down. And this is what leads to disinflation. It's the exact same thing that we saw play out during the GFC. And I'd like to remind you that during this time, when we had the inflation rate in 2008 go from 5.6 all the way down to 0, the Fed was not hiking rates. The Fed was cutting rates dramatically during this time. So then the question becomes, okay, what is M2 money supply doing right now? And although we had a huge run up during the cerveza sickness, you guys know that, that's pretty much completely played out. From 2022, called April of 2022, to today's date, M2 money supply is actually lower. So this is why the average Joe and Jane is struggling so much, because their incomes haven't gone up at the same rate as inflation, and therefore their overall purchasing power has gone down. And this is one of the main reasons why we in the United States have seen this disinflationary trend since the middle of 2022. So the main takeaway from step number 2 is there's no way the Fed can argue that higher taxes in the form of tariffs or higher oil prices are going to lead to an acceleration of consumer price inflation when we have M2 money supply basically flat for the last 3 years and we have an extremely weak economy. If history is a teacher, it shows us these high oil prices or high tariffs, which would be higher prices for non-economic reasons, can actually tip the economy into a recession that always leads to less inflation, not more consumer price inflation. I know a lot of you right about now are saying, well, George, in the 1970s, we had a weak economy and high rates of inflation. It's called stagflation. That's right. But even during the 1970s, when you had economic contraction, a spike in the unemployment rate, in other words, a recession, this led to disinflation. It didn't lead to a reacceleration of consumer prices.
Number 3, now let's look at the history of the Fed rate cutting cycles and determine how often they get this right. We'll look at a chart, today's date, going all the way back to 1985. On the left, we go from 0% up to 10%. And back in the good old days, 1985, interest rates, Fed funds, the overnight rate, 7.5%. Wow. It goes up to 10%, and then it comes crashing all the way down to call it 3%. Why is this? Because we had a recession. In fact, every single time you see the Fed funds rate crash, it is preceded by a recession. Okay, well, let's think this through. So how often, going all the way back to 1985, and I use 1985 for a reason. It's because pre-1985 or even late 80s, the Fed didn't try to control interest rates.
They had a range prior to Volcker, and Volcker was more focused on the amount of bank reserves and how that impacted M2 money supply. So there wasn't a specific interest rate set by the Fed. That was really something that was implemented by Alan Greenspan. So going all the way back to 1985, the modern Fed, if you will, how many times did the Fed cut rates too early? In other words, they cut rates massively, and then we had a reacceleration of consumer price inflation. That would be, that would be 0 times the Fed has cut too early. Because every single time they cut, we don't get a reacceleration of inflation, we get disinflation and an economic contraction. In other words, a recession, if not something worse. So I'm not here saying that the Fed's rate cutting cycles is what causes, it just happens to correlate. So then let's look at it from the other angle. We know that they've never cut too early. So have they ever cut too late? Well, the simple fact that they're cutting and then we always have a recession, you could argue that they have never been too early, but they have always been too late to cut. And in fact, editor, go ahead and throw up a chart of the 2-year Treasury yield, and we can see that the Fed funds has tracked the 2-year yield, but always with a lag. And I'd like to point out that it's not just on the way down, but also on the way up. So the Fed is not only late with cutting rates, they're also late with hiking rates to begin with, which is exactly what we saw during the inflation of 2021 and into 2022. Right about now, your friend and family member Fred is probably pointing to this arrow and saying, wait a minute. All my friends and my protectors, the central planners, the politicians, and the PhDs at the Federal Reserve, you can't say that they always get it wrong because they got it right here. Look, they dropped rates and we didn't have a recession. And this is a good point, but I would ask your friend and family member Fred if this 25 or maybe 50 basis point drop really impacted the economy significantly enough to avoid a recession. Or would we have had a recession to begin with? My answer is no. Why? Look at the yield curve. We did not see huge inversions across the entire curve like we have seen in the very recent past, and also every single time we get one of these big recessions, economic contractions, or in the case of the GFC, right here, something even worse. So my point is, I think your friend and family member Fred would be confusing correlation and causation. But the bottom line from this step, even if you want to give him the benefit of the doubt, is the Fed almost always is too late to not only cutting, but hiking rates. So this time, I don't know why it would be any different, especially when you consider everything that we discussed in step number 1 about the economy being weak, all the data getting weaker and weaker and weaker, and what we discussed in step number 2 about how the increase in taxes in the form of tariffs or oil prices could tip the economy completely over the edge like we saw during the GFC. But I want to be crystal clear about something. Throughout this video, I've been telling you what I think the Fed should do based on their metrics and their models and based on how they see the world. But at the end of the day, do I think that the Fed or what they do with the interest rate actually controls the economy? Absolutely not. I think that they just respond to the economy. Said another way, I think interest rates are a reflection of what's actually happening in the economy, and they don't necessarily control the economy itself. So the bottom line is, even if the Fed does drop rates right now and throughout the rest of 2025, do I think that will avoid whatever economic storm clouds we have coming our way? The answer is no. It might make it slightly better, but it's not going to avoid the inevitable. The Fed is never, ever going to be able to control the business cycle. And if you want further proof, editor, go ahead and throw up the yield curve right now, and we could see that many of the interest rates are below the Fed funds rate. So let's just assume for a moment that Jerome Powell comes out and drops interest rates by 25 or 50 basis points. Okay, well that's just going to impact, let's just say, the overnight rate to the 6-month rate. It's not going to really have a huge impact on all the other interest rates, more specifically the 10-year and the 30-year, which has a disproportionate impact on the overall economy. So what we have to understand is, although the Fed might control the overnight rate, they definitely do not control interest rates across the curve, and those interest rates don't necessarily control the economy. They're more so a reflection of what's happening in the economy from a standpoint of the economy doing worse or doing better.